to LYF Bible Study. This is Lesson 25, Sanhedrin, where we will be talking about Jesus' final words to his disciples, his arrest in Gethsemane, and his trial before the Sanhedrin, hence the title. As always, a bit of quick review. Jesus has spoken about the end times and tied them to what's about to happen. And he has just finished celebrating the Passover and fulfilling it, celebrating it on the eve, remembering the Jewish day begins at evening, so the eve of the first day, and during this he has established the Holy Eucharist, what we sometimes call the Lord's Supper, as a part of a first century Seder. As I said last week, we will be skipping around a lot of the Gospels. We're trying to keep a linear account here. I will be following primarily Alfred Edersheim's chronology. There are some other chronologies I'll be using, and this requires switching between the Gospels because the different writers have different perspectives. Now, we'll be starting in Luke, but there will be passages where I may supplement even in the middle with a different Gospel or something like that. I will not, stop and say this is a different Gospel, but it will be reflected on the screen. So just jumping right into it with Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 30. Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And he said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table, or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. But you are those who have continued with me in my trials, and I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Now, Jesus has called them before, in the sense that he has set them out on two different discipleship missions. But this is really their first call, in a way, as apostles, even though it won't be truly fulfilled until after the resurrection. This is where he promises them thrones and says they're going to sit on these thrones and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. They will rule over the eternal Israel when he fully comes into his own, as it were, as the Messiah. But he's also rebuking them because they're not following his example. As his Talmidim, they should be following him in all ways. And the entirety of his ministry up to this point, even in selecting the room that they just celebrated the Passover in, has been an exercise in humility. And they haven't quite figured it out. It's also interesting that he mentions, the greatest of you should be as the least. That's going to come up in our accounts today, because remember who the greatest of the apostles is at this point. It is also the oldest one, and it is Peter. And the youngest, and the quote-unquote least, is St. John the Beloved. But we're going to see both of those characters. They're going to take a more central role in the entirety of the Passion and Resurrection accounts than they have thus far, as a duo, as it were. So, of course, Jesus has also promised them thrones in the Messianic kingdom. And this is interesting because he knows what they're about to do. He's complimented them for being with him in his trials, but he knows they're about to abandon him. He knows what's coming. And they don't know the impact of what they've done. They don't know what the impact of what they're about to do. But he before he even really starts them on their mission, before he's even died and risen again, he promises them the reward that is due to a disciple. And it's tied to his status as the Messiah. They will be his regents or his stewards, and they will receive a fitting and parallel reward. Staying with Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, verses 31 through 34, "And the Lord said, 'Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren.' But he said to him, 'Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death.' Then he said, 'I tell you, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny 3 times that you know me.'" So Jesus has opened this with calling him Simon twice. This old name, this given name that Peter has, instead of the one that Jesus has given him when he called him and when he established his authority. It's a reference and a picture of that old Adam that dwells in Peter at this time. But there's also an encouragement. Jesus says, even from the beginning, I know you're going to, as these events unfold, I know you're going to deny me. but I know you're going to return, and I know that when you do, you will strengthen your brethren. It's still, even though knowing what Peter is going to do, Jesus is still relying on him as the oldest, as the greatest, to help with the other disciples and help the other apostles. But Peter doesn't get that. There's a lot of contrast and similarity in the accounts both last week and this week and elsewhere in the Gospels, where Peter really contrasts with Judas Iscariot, especially in Luke and John. Satan seeks after both of them. Jesus has just said, Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat, whereas it says that Satan has entered Judas Iscariot. The language used for how Satan asks after Peter is very much akin to the idea of how Satan appears in the book of Job as a tester. The implication being Satan wants to test you, Peter, because he doesn't think you'll succeed, but I know you'll succeed because I've prayed for you, and I know where your faith will end up. But the response to both of these pronouncements, because Jesus also, if you may remember last week, he gave Judas Iscariot the sop, saying, who I give this to is the betrayer. And Judas has the chutzpah to go, is it me? And Peter has the chutzpah to go, I wouldn't do this. Like there's chutzpah here, and it's not the good kind. It's not chutzpah klatei shmea, spiritual audacity. It is just brash ego and bold-facedness. Even, both times Jesus says something's going to happen and they both have the gall to act surprised. Peter goes so far as to deny it and just double down, saying, I'm not going to do this. You are wrong. And Peter's done that to Jesus before. In fact, one of the last times he did it was when Jesus prophesied his death and resurrection. And Peter said, no, Lord, do not say this. This couldn't happen to you. And Jesus immediately responds with, get you behind me, Satan. And this is very much Peter. Peter is brash. He is intense. He loves Jesus. He just doesn't necessarily know the best way to show it. Whereas Judas doesn't love Jesus. And this leads to them responding different ways when they both betray Christ. They both fail a temptation, but they react differently to that betrayal, and it leads them to very different ends. And they will thus serve us as object lessons throughout this and indeed the rest of our accounts. Literally until the end of this study, we will be learning from the object lessons of either Judas or Peter. But we should be careful judging both of them too harshly. There's this thing that seems to be really popular in the church. I remember it from really back when I was in youth group, and I've seen it ever since. This idea of a downward comparison. It's really no different than, comparing yourself to like a 2-year-old to make yourself say, hey, at least I run better than that 2-year-old, or morally to say, oh, at least I'm not a murderer. And there's a lot of this that happens with biblical figures, and Peter gets to be the victim of that a lot. Peter and David. And King David is the man after God's own heart who committed murder and committed adultery, and yet God still called him the man after his own heart. Unless somebody listening to this knows something I don't, God has never said that again. Jesus has never said that again. There was a special relationship with David, but people like to really go down on him and yell at him and say what a bad person he is. And people like to do the same thing with Peter here, saying, basically saying, ironically, the same thing Peter said. I wouldn't have done that. I'd have stayed. What a coward Peter is. What a brash fool Peter is. When it's very likely we'd have done the same thing, and in fact we are even doing the same thing by judging Peter. And it's also worth not judging Judas too harshly in the sense that there but for the grace of God go we all. But specifically with Peter, Peter is the chief of the apostles. We just read that he's explicitly promised a throne next to Jesus. Again, unless you know something I don't, I certainly at least have never been promised a throne by Jesus, so all I can conclude is that my own sins far outweigh St. Peter's. And Peter and John are going to exhibit a lot more faith than the rest of the disciples by their actions during and after the events of Passion Week. So as we move forward, we should not judge either of them too harshly. Keeping on in Luke for now, chapter 22, verses 35 through 38. And he said to them, when I sent you without money, bag, knapsack, and sandals, did you lack anything? So they said, nothing. Then he said to them, But now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must still be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. So they said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. So Jesus is once again ramping up the apostolic call. He sent them out, the first without any supplies, and the second time with some supplies. The idea being that while they ministered in Israel, they would be cared for by Israel. The time of full rejection hadn't come, but it's come now. And they won't be able to rely on a welcome from not even their fellow Israelites, let alone the Gentiles that he's about to send them out to. So they need to provide for themselves. So they have money to sustain them on the road, kept in a purse or a money bag, a knapsack to keep their supplies, and a sword, a protection against other men. And also it has a specific meaning here that Jesus should be numbered with the transgressors. This has been misapplied in a few different ways, so just a word on what he means by selling a sword or selling a cloak and buying a sword. These are 2 historical swords. Both would have been extant at the time of Jesus in the land of Israel. The top one is called a sika. It's more Middle Eastern, Far Eastern European curved sword. And the other one's a gladius of the Mainz type. Again, the common Roman sword of the time. Jesus is not calling them to go to war. When he says to buy a sword, which could have looked like either of these, he is not doing the same thing as saying, hey, go buy an M16 or an AK-47. He's basically saying buy the modern weapon equivalent. A couple of commenters noted, well, one said would be a brace of pistols because he was writing back in the 19th century. But another one has said, this is a personal protection type of gun. They're not being called to go to physical war, but he's basically saying you're going to be walking long roads and there will be bandits, there will be dangers. You will have to protect yourself. You will need this tool of self-protection. He's not calling them to go out and establish a state. He's not calling them to go out and go to physical war. Spiritual war, absolutely. Not physical war. So that's just a brief note on that. Switching now to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 36 through 44. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said to the disciples, sit here while I go and pray over there. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, what, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, a second time, he went away and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away again, and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same words. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. This is known as the agony in Gethsemane. It is a pure picture of Jesus at his most human, just as when he wept over Lazarus. And as the other Gospels don't have the account of Lazarus, it is the most human of the synoptic accounts. He knows what's going to happen to him. He's going to suffer physically, psychologically, and spiritually. It's going to be more than certainly anyone in a modern Western society could imagine. And frankly, I would say more than any human could imagine because of that last element, that spiritual torment. He knows he's not just about to be beaten, scourged. He's not just about to be crucified. He is about to suffer the wrath of hell for all sinners on himself, and he is about to be separated from God. And he doesn't want to do it. But something to note is how Jesus prays. He prays, not my will, but thy will be done. There's this idea that we're Stoics, that Christians are supposed to be Stoics who believe that suffering is suffering's as good as not suffering. You just endure it, you just go through it. You shouldn't want to get away from it. Or even some Christians who take more of a sadistic tone, like pain is good, suffering is good, it cleanses you, seek it out. But that's not the picture that Jesus gives us here. Jesus knows suffering is coming and he wants to avoid it. But he doesn't say, take me out of it. He says, if it is your will, take me out of it. But it's not what I want, it's what you want. And that's the example of how we deal with pain. The verse where it says he sweats as if it were great drops of blood, this is an actual medical condition. You can look up pictures of it if you want. I'm not going to put them here because they're disgusting. But it's going to be, and I'm about to mangle how you pronounce these, but it's hematidrosis and hemolacria. The first one means sweating. The second one means crying blood, and it's often done often results as after extreme stress. Tiny blood vessels in the skin break open. They either get the blood either gets squeezed out. I can't think of the word I'm looking for. Excreted. That's the word. It gets excreted through the sweat glands. Sometimes it just kind of leaks out of the skin through hair follicles, or just comes out onto the skin surface. It leaves the skin incredibly tender and sensitive. In a very real way, Jesus' torment has already begun. It's already starting. Because what he's suffering here is, he's about to get beaten and scourged and nailed to a cross. And the agony of this knowledge is making those future agonies physically worse. Another thing to note here is that Jesus prays 3 times, and numbers are not accidental in Scripture, certainly never the number 3. 3 is the number of completion, and in what we could call Old Testament thought, there are 3 patriarchs, 3 pilgrimage festivals. 3 is the number of completion. There's also a rabbinic parallel. When you want to become a Talmid, I think I mentioned this back a few lessons ago, when you want to become a Talmid or a disciple, you sometimes have to ask up to 3 times. And so it was often a common practice for a rabbi to say no those first 2 because they're testing you. They want to see how tenacious you are. And then the 3rd time, they will say yes if they're going to take you. And if not, then you're truly rejected. The answer is only truly no at the 3rd time. This has been tied in some schools of thought to the idea that Jews pray 3 times a day, as per Daniel 6, and thus, because there are 3 prayers, you should ask for something 3 times. But Jesus is strengthened by an angel, but the angel also seems to bring him his answer. The answer to the question is no. The cup can't pass on. This has been ordained since before time began. This is something that Jesus he knew this was coming. The Godhead had worked this out among itself. There's a English theologian named John Flavel who illustrates this in a little bit hard to read, but still excellent treatise. I'm going to link to it in the handout. You can just click on that PDF if you're interested. Basically, this is the conversation between the Godhead where they determine the plan of salvation. And if you're interested, there's also going to be there's a musical version of that dialogue by a Christian band that I'll also link to in the handout. But this is an example that Jesus, even though he's been part of this conversation as God, as part of the 3-in-1, he knew that this was coming. But he also rests comfortable in the knowledge that he's going to be strengthened. Again, even in the Catechism, what are the 3 answers to prayer? One of them's no. We do not trust that God is always going to answer prayer in the affirmative. He doesn't always answer in the affirmative. The answer can be no, and that can suck, and it can be really hard. But we know that even when God says no, he's going to strengthen us. Moving into the Gospel of John, verses 1 through 9 of chapter 18. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment, and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." Now his betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him." Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. But Jesus said to him, "Companion, why have you come?" But Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, "Permit even this." And he touched his ear and healed him. But Jesus said to them, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus?" In that hour Jesus said to the multitudes, "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young man laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. A lot to go over in this account, obviously. First off, this detachment that Judas brings in movies like The Passion and a lot of contemporary representations, they're represented as if they were temple guards. They're not likely temple guards. This is a Roman cohort in all likelihood. There would be a special cohort brought into Jerusalem to deal with the fact that this was a feast time and there's more of a risk of riots. The Sadducees, Judas has gone to the Sadducees, the high priest. The priests basically own Pilate. We're going to talk about him next week. But Pilate is neither a competent, strong, wise, or in any synonym for the word good as a leader. And he was basically owned by the Sadducees in a lot of ways. So it's not hard to imagine that Judas could have gotten an actual Roman guard. It's also worth noting that the temple guards didn't have they were basically mall cops. They didn't have the right to arrest people, and the Romans wouldn't have tolerated that, especially with the rising tensions at the time. Note that when Jesus says, "I am," they're struck down with a divine power. Remember, from our Gospel of John study a couple years ago, every time Jesus says, "I am," he is declaring himself to be God, the same way that when Moses asked the Lord in the burning bush, "Who do I say you are? I am that I am." So Jesus has to basically help them. They fall down in awe at the statement of who he is, and he has to go, "Why are you here again?" And then that reminds them of what they're doing. When Judas kisses him, the word in Greek is kataphileo, and the actual word Judas kataphilesen, because it's a verb. It means that he's kissing Jesus repeatedly. He's being panicked and hysterical. Judas is already having some buyer's remorse here. And that's only going to get worse, because if you're reading along in your Bibles, not using the screen, you may have noticed that the word that I translated as, or rather I didn't translate, the word in the previous passage, I put companion there and I underlined it instead of friend. It's often translated as friend, but the word in Greek is heteros. And it's not really friend. Phileo would have been the more likely, or philos would have been the more likely word for friend. He's using the word heteros, or rather that is being used in the Greek. Jesus was speaking Aramaic, because Jesus is making a point. Heteros basically translates as companion, comrade, kinsman, one who is close to me. And he's saying, you who are close to me, what are you doing? Why are you here? By just pointing out the sin, Judas already starts to go a little bit crazy. He also calls out the Israelite leaders and who have come with this Roman cohort similarly. He's not like hurling accusations. He's not even getting angry. He's just pointing out the blatant facts. You could have arrested me at any time. But now you're acting like I'm someone dangerous, even though I'm clearly not. Note also that we know that from the Gospel of John it was Peter who attacked the high priest's servant Malchus. And Jesus rebukes him because his actions represent the disciples' misunderstanding. But then Jesus heals Malchus. And that's incredible, because Jesus is basically showing, every time I taught you mercy, I meant it. And now I am going to live it. He also seems to have, he also is saying to them they've misunderstood, why he told them to buy swords. The Zealots, one of whom was a disciple, Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were a Galilean, primarily, organization. Josephus calls them the fourth sect. They were often allied with the Pharisees in some ways. They hated the Sadducees. They believed that they could free Israel by violence. In fact, only a few years after Christ's ascension, they would create the first actual assassin organization that we know of in history, the Sicarii, an extremist group of zealots who would hide daggers up their sleeves, stab people in public, and then blend back into the crowd. And they thought violence could come around. Galileans were generally suspect as being zealots, and indeed a lot of Galileans had sympathies with zealots. The specific fulfillment of them having swords at Gethsemane isn't so that they can stop Jesus from going to the cross. It's that so that Jesus can be numbered among the malefactors. It is an intentional fulfillment of a prophecy, as well as him giving them an account and a genuine teaching about how they're going to live once they're on the road, as it were. Finally, it's likely that this cohort has gone to the house of Mark first. That passage from Mark is Mark inserting himself into the text. Mark's house was the one, or rather Mark's father's house was most likely the one where Passover had been held, so Judas probably brought the cohort there first, saw that they were gone, and goes, okay, Gethsemane, that's where they'll be, I know where they'll be. And Mark's following them, knowing what's happening. It's really important to note, by the way, here, and I'll bring this up again, this is already highly illegal. By Jewish law, you could not arrest a man at night. It had to be done in broad day. It could not be done on the information given by a colleague of the accused, which is why Jesus basically calls Judas a colleague. It would be unjust in Talmudic law to arrest someone this way. It was unjust, and the Sadducees know it. This is basically police brutality at its finest. It's also worth noting that this is failure, in the sense of everyone around him's expectations about what Jesus is going to do as the Messiah. This is the pinnacle of quote-unquote failure. We mentioned last week that Jesus is already disappointing some of the disciples in the sense that what's been going on. Well, now everything's gone completely belly up. The same leaders of Israel that should have been adoring him are having him arrested, and by the same Gentiles who are oppressing the nation that they thought Jesus should deliver them from. One of the inner circle of Talmudim has betrayed his own rabbi, and even while Jesus says, I could call angels, but I won't, because this is what has to happen. This has got to be the most demoralizing thing the disciples could experience, and it's intentionally so. It breaks them of their expectations, and they only after seeing this can they start to realize what Jesus' mission actually is. This is why Paul says in 1 Corinthians, we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. Moving on with John chapter 18, verses 12 through 24. Then the detachment and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, and they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, You are not also of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, "I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues, and in the temple where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said." And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. This introduces what's going to be the first of Jesus' kangaroo trials, this questioning at the house of Annas, the former high priest, or it might be better to describe him as the high priest emeritus. We'll talk about that in a bit. The Sanhedrin itself was the governing body of Israel, made up of rabbis, scribes, and priests. It had pretty much only religious authority by this point. There are two chief leaders in a functioning Sanhedrin: the Nasi, the prince, and the Av Beit Din, the chief justice. The Nasi, very awkward slip up. The Nasi was the president, and the Av Beit Din, the vice president, essentially, and how it operates. Now, at the time of Jesus, we know who the Nasi was. It was Gamaliel, the same one who trained St. Paul. Now, there was no Av Beit Din. Interestingly, Caiaphas, about 10 to 15 years before this, he had been next in line to be the Av Beit Din. But the Pharisees, especially the school of Shammai, had stripped him of his power and temporarily abolished the office. They saw Annas and his son-in-law Caiaphas as utterly evil. And they're like, "You have ruined the priesthood. You are terrible people. It's better this office doesn't exist than someone like you occupy it." Now, the thing about the Sanhedrin is that with it operating the way it operates, with Caiaphas supposed to be the Av Beit Din, but just relegated basically to just being an ordinary member, he's using bullying power. In any other context, I might call it moral suasion, but it's the height of immorality, so we'll call it his bullying power. Annas and Caiaphas are using that to get some, not all, members of the council here. But Jesus was never actually tried by the Sanhedrin. His trial was utterly illegal under Sanhedrin law. This was a kangaroo court made up of some members of the Sanhedrin, and no one who has actually studied how the Sanhedrin works would say that, or does say, that this was a functioning trial. There are Jewish rabbis who hate Christianity and everything it stands for, and they'll even say this was not a valid trial. There was no right to do what they did. And there's a reason they weren't doing it the way that it should have been done. It's because it wouldn't have worked in any way, shape, or form. And the Sadducees know this, which is why they're trying to pass the buck and get this done as quickly as possible and as illicitly as possible. So first off, Annas and Caiaphas. Annas was essentially at this point the patriarch of the high priestly family. Caiaphas was his son-in-law, and Annas is the power behind the throne. Annas had 5 of his sons, his son-in-law Caiaphas, and his grandson serve as the high priest during his life. He hadn't been high priest at this point for over 20 years. He served as the high priest for about 7 years, and then Quirinius, the governor at that time, who was 2 governors before Pilate, he had quarreled with Quirinius, and Quirinius had excused Annas from the office. But Annas just kept pushing his own dynasty into the office. He was the high priest emeritus, essentially. And that's why John calls him the high priest, because everyone knows what he was, and everyone knew what he was doing. Again, it is illegal for Jesus to have been brought to Annas' house under Talmud law. He is arrested at night. Not okay. He is not to be questioned privately or at night. Both are occurring. This should be occurring in a very different way. But Annas wants a rushed trial so he can kind of claim legality and rid himself of Jesus. And he knows this because if he actually puts Jesus in front of the real Sanhedrin, the full Sanhedrin, he's not going to get the results he wants. The Sanhedrin did not like condemning people to death. In fact, it says in the Talmud that more than one execution every 70 years, that's 70 years, meant that you were a murderous Sanhedrin. And many rabbis actually became anti-death penalty. Some say it may have actually been because of the trial of Jesus, as one of them is Rabbi Akiva, who was post Jesus. They actually became actively anti-death penalty because they feared that even killing one innocent person would drag the wrath of God onto them. So this is why Annas is doing things this way. I'm not saying that the Pharisees would have gone for Jesus and sided with him actively, but they'd have still found this totally unacceptable, and they would have still not found what Annas is doing okay. Back to John 18. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So Peter went out and wept bitterly. We're going to go back in time a little bit here, and the reason for that is to kind of give you a state of mind for Peter. Peter is very scared. I am a psychologist. Fear and emotion are bad decision-making tools. They're not designed for that. God did not give us them to help us make decisions. If that was why he gave them to us, he did a really bad job, but obviously he didn't give them to us. So Peter is making decisions based on fear. And now and that's why I switched to the Luke account, because Luke records that Jesus actually looks at Peter and everything comes rushing back. And there's a parallel here to 2 separate events from Peter's past. So first, going back to Luke chapter 5. When Jesus had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats, so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid, for from now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. I just realized this next passage is mislabeled. This is not from the Gospel of Mark. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So the very first time Peter was called as a disciple, his first reaction, realizing who Jesus was to say, "Lord, you shouldn't be near me. I'm sinful. I could pollute you." And then, when he's tried to exercise his faith before, again, of all the apostles, he's the one with the most chutzpah, both good and bad. He's the one who says, "If it's really you, I want to walk on water too. I want to get out of the boat." And he didn't have quite enough faith. But he had enough to get him out, but he wasn't quite there. It's why Jesus still needs to pray for him, as Jesus said earlier, because he needs more faith. And here it's the same situation. Where he first had said, "Lord, depart from me, for I'm a man full of sin." Now he's just basically trying to get Jesus' association away from him because he's afraid. And now he's walked out on the water. He doesn't have the protection that John does. John's known to the high priests. Peter isn't. Peter also, attacked Malchus, and he was right. He's more likely to be recognized. He was right. And now, in Luke's account, we hear that he actually swears an oath. He breaks the Jewish numbered third commandment, our Lutheran numbering second, by swearing an oath that he doesn't know Jesus. And he breaks. Again, he's contrasted with Judas, who's also going to show remorse. But Peter's going to not just show remorse, he's going to actually repent. But Jesus, looking at Peter, seems to break him. The same way that, Jesus looked at Peter and Peter looked at him and he understood who Jesus was and how sinful he was. Now Peter's had that same experience and there's nothing he can do. This is his best friend. This is his rabbi. This is somebody who lived in his house, who healed his mother-in-law, who has been with him for 3 years, who gave him the name Peter, who dragged him out of the water, who just told him he would give him a throne. Jesus has never once abandoned him, and Peter thought he was special. And why not? Look at all the things he's done. I'm the rock on which the church will be built. I have the keys to the kingdom. I struck a blow to stop them arresting him. And he's brought low because of his misplaced faith and his reliance on himself instead of on God. And he is broken. But again, unlike Judas, Peter will come back. But we're going to leave Peter and return to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And the high priest arose and said to him, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "As you have said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now, you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered and said, "He is deserving of death." Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?" When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. When they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Historically, the Sanhedrin, as I already said, was reluctant to condemn anyone to death. That's why Jesus is not given an official Sanhedrin trial. But there's a party divide here, and there's political stuff beyond the fact that Caiaphas, has lost his authority. In fact, he never had it. There's a Pharisee and Sadducee divide here. Pharisees really did not want to execute people, generally. There are Pharisee representatives here, we know this. But generally, Pharisees were not really all that keen on judging too harshly in terms of actual legal penalties like stoning or even corporal punishment. Whereas Josephus tells us the Sadducees are indeed more heartless than any other Jews when they sit in judgment. This trial is an affront to every piece of Jewish law. And this is why I'm not defending the Pharisees here. I'm not saying they were going to be on Jesus' side. Indeed, at this point, with Jesus saying he's the Son of God, they would probably not be happy with him. But they also wouldn't have gotten to this level. Remember, they love the outward law. They love following the letter of the law. And this doesn't even follow the letter of the law. The trial is unscheduled. It's supposed to be scheduled. It's not supposed to be at night. He's not supposed to be questioned at night. He's not supposed to be arrested at night. All of that's happened. They've waited till day or bare dawnbreak to begin the official trial. That's not okay. Doesn't have the presence of the prince, the Nasi. He's not there. Gamaliel is not here. And Luke mentions Gamaliel early in the book of Acts. So Gamaliel was aware of who Jesus was. Gamaliel is not present here. This is a total sham of a trial. And it's not even at the right location. It's supposed to be in the temple courts. This is an utter travesty of justice. Some other things that this has done, just to really drive home what the Sadducees are doing here, what the priests, the leader of Israel, what the priest is doing. Members of the court may not alertly and intelligently hear the testimony against the accused during the hours of darkness. Well, they've already done that. Once they've heard witnesses, by the way, the witnesses have to agree with each other, more on that in a minute. But after hearing witnesses who met the very, very intense standards of proof, and by the way, if you want to look into the proof levels, we'll go over a few of them. I had to spend like an hour going over all of them. The American justice system, the British justice system, any common law justice system is way less strict on witnesses than the Talmud is. The Talmud is on witness agreement because they thought it was really serious. So after hearing witnesses, judges are supposed to take at least a day, if not two, separate from each other, thinking about if the sentence of death is warranted. Obviously, they're not doing that. The voting for the death sentence was supposed to start with the youngest and go to the oldest so that no one would be swayed or feel intimidated. Again, not something that's happened here. In fact, you're not supposed to have this sort of all in favor, say aye type of voting. That's just not acceptable in Jewish justice, but they don't care. About the standards of proof. Two witnesses, they have to have observed the crime. If they're caught lying, they'll be executed instead, though the Sadducees made a specific exception to this belief. Among some of the things they had to be able to do, witnesses had to see each other at the time of the crime. They had to be able to speak clearly. They could not be related to each other or the accused. They had to have warned the accused of the dangers of sin within like seconds of it occurring. They could not contradict each other on even the slightest detail, and they had to execute the accused themselves. This trial, Caiaphas was not exactly a strong man. He was actually kind of a wuss. He's controlled by his father-in-law. But even his father-in-law, Annas and Caiaphas are so powerless, they can't even rig a trial correctly. And Jesus has to actually help them. Because if he'd stayed quiet, it might have gone differently. But Jesus knows he has to do this. He's been told the cup cannot pass. You have to drink it. So when they say, "Are you the Messiah?" he gives them an answer that he knows is going to end in his death. He knows it. But they can't do it themselves. It's not funny in the sense that this is the greatest tragedy in history, but you can't help but laugh at the sheer ineptitude, the sheer castrated nature of the high priest's power at this point. Also worth noting, the high priest tears his clothes. He's not supposed to do that by law. In fact, the ephod that the high priest would wear into the Holy of Holies was specifically designed so it could not tear. Now, yes, if he wasn't wearing his blue ephod, he wasn't breaking the law per se. But the entire idea was that he wasn't supposed to rend his clothes in the presence of God. Because remember, in the Holy of Holies, at least when the ark was there, he is before the very presence of God who dwells between those two cherubim on the top of the ark. And who's in front of Caiaphas right now? Jesus is God, and Caiaphas is right in front of God, and he breaks the law, even though he doesn't know it. The irony is astronomical. The high priest, the only one who can ever see God face to face in the Holy of Holies, doesn't understand that he's seeing God face to face in the incarnation. It would be funny if it wasn't tragic. We then see that Jesus is beaten and scorned. Again, contrary to what you see in action movies, being punched and slapped, that hurts. It can result in permanent injury. If you've ever done boxing, martial arts, what have you, you'll know this. The court here is committing the same crime of which they accuse Jesus, including blasphemy. As you tell us, Jesus, who hit you? But again, the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin may not have liked condemning people to death, but by this time it was also kind of a moot point. Try as they might, even as much as they own Pilate, capital punishment's a serious, serious affair to the Romans. And they're neutered. They can't do it themselves. They're going to try to pass the buck. And it's worth noting that they have a unique interpretation of the law that kind of leaves them feeling that they're innocent of Jesus' blood. The entirety of the account is going to be people saying, "I am innocent of this person's blood," or at least saying things to that account from here on out. Nobody wants to take the blame for killing Jesus, and the irony is that everyone takes the blame for killing Jesus. But we'll talk more about that next week. Final passage, Matthew 27, verses 3 through 10. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, What is that to us? You see to it. Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed, and went and hanged himself. But the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, because they are the price of blood. And they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, who they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. This is the most sanitized version of Judas Iscariot's actions I could find. It's worth noting from the beginning, Book of Deuteronomy, he who is hanged is accursed from God. We don't know if Judas actually used a rope. Some people have actually speculated he may have tried to crucify himself, because we learn from the book of Acts that he actually falls down and is dashed to pieces on rocks. It's the words in Acts say his entrails splattered out. This is often used as a justification for the Bible contradicting itself. It doesn't. They're utterly compatible. But we don't know how Judas specifically tried to hang himself. We don't even know when it occurred. Some people date this where I've put it. Some people put it when Jesus is visiting Herod. Some people put it when Jesus is on his way to the cross. Some people put it as there are some early church traditions that say Judas does this seeing Jesus crucified. He follows the priests back when they go, and then that's why they don't want to deal with him. They're rushing back to prepare for the Sabbath. We don't know. But I think it's important to close with it because it's going to highlight what we see moving on. Again, some Greek. Metanoeo in Greek is the Greek word for repentance. It literally means to turn away. It's not the word used for what Judas says here when it was translated as remorse, being remorseful. It's metamelame. There we go, metamelame, to change one's mind. Judas does not seem to have repented. And by the way, he's not trying to atone either. People say that suicide is he's trying to take the place of Jesus. That's not something Jews would have thought at the time. He just wants to undo what he's done. He feels guilty, but at least from the text, it doesn't seem that he repented. Also worth noting, this prophecy in Jeremiah, you can't find those words in the book of Jeremiah. It's believed to be a reference to Jeremiah 19 with the prophecy of the potter's field. Also, each book of the Bible didn't get its own scroll, and the way the prophets are divided in Tanakh, the Zechariah prophecy we read last week would have been in the Jeremiah scroll. So that's what's being referenced here. It's not a contradiction. You just have to look, to how it was intended. Again, there's a supposed contradiction with Acts chapter 1, verses 18 through 19, which said that he fell and burst asunder, his entrails spewed out, and that's why it's called the field of blood. There are a number of explanations for this. Two of the most common ones would be post-mortem bloat. He succeeds at hanging himself. His body starts decaying. The rope breaks. He falls. Gross things occur. Another popular explanation is that he may not have used an especially good rope. There's an early church tradition that he tried to hang himself with his belt, and the rope broke, and he fell onto the stones in the potter's field and was dashed to pieces. Either way, this is not a contradiction. It's worth noting. And either way, it's a horrible end. It would have been better for that man that he were not born. But the priests are in a conundrum. They can't take that money back. It can't be made korban because it's Judas's, technically. It was a redemption price of blood. They can't take it back. So, again, in Acts 1, they say Judas bought the field. Well, it was bought for him. But in a Jewish context, yes. In a Jewish perspective, yes. Judas bought his own field through his treachery. And again, it's worth noting that Judas is not trying to atone for his sin. This is not him suiciding himself to make up for what he did. That is a Gentile honor-related idea. This is not a Jewish idea. What he has done is he's given into despair when he could have been restored. Now, we don't know Judas's eternal state. We know that Jesus died for the sins of the world, and he has not, again, unless I am missing something, And unless somebody has experienced something and is not telling me, none of us currently living have been told that we have the ability to tell where people ended up in the end. We don't know. We know that heaven exists. We know hell exists. We know the resurrection will come. Certainly what Judas did was not beyond forgiveness. But it is still a parallel to see that, Jesus is innocent, and he takes the cursed death of being hung upon a tree on himself, that he becomes a curse for us. Judas is hung on a tree because of his own sin and as a response to his own sin. He is a very tragic figure. And again, it's as we leave Judas behind us, this would have broke the early church in a lot of ways as well, were it not for what we see Peter do in Acts 1. One of the 12 has died a cursed death after betraying Jesus. This is somebody who's followed Jesus around for 3 years, learned from him, been trusted by him with the money box, been sent out by him, and this is where he ended up. Judas is not here for us to go, he's not there for us for a downward comparison, to go, at least we're better than Judas. That is not why he's here. Judas is here for us to take as a warning. There but for the grace of God go we. We'll come back next week for Jesus' only semi-real trial before Pontius Pilate, where again Jesus will fulfill his own prophecy, as we read last week. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, but it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony.